Hey buddy, welcome back. If you're watching this, it probably means the day is finally over. Maybe the lights in the house are already off except for the one lamp by your bed or the glow of the screen you're holding. Maybe you're lying on your side with a blanket pulled up to your chin and your body is starting to feel heavy in that good way, the way it feels right before sleep decides to take you. That's exactly where I want you to be tonight. So go ahead. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillow one more time. Settle your shoulders down. Let your jaw relax and just breathe out slowly like you're letting go of something you've been carrying around all day. You don't need to hold on to anything right now. Not your to-do list, not tomorrow, not anything. Tonight belongs to a much older world, one lit by oil lamps and hearth fires, where people looked up at the same moon we do and wondered about the same questions we still ask. Where do we go when we die? What waits for us in the dark? And is there anyone down there watching over it, keeping some kind of order in a place none of us can see? Tonight we're going somewhere most people are afraid to go, at least in the stories. We're going down beneath the roots of the mountains, beneath the rivers, into the quiet halls of the god the ancient Greeks rarely even said by name out loud. They called him something else instead, out of respect, or maybe out of fear. But we're going to say his name tonight, gently, the way you'd speak in a house where someone was sleeping. Hades. Before we start, if this is your first time here, this channel is called The Quiet Past, also known as Boring History for Sleep, and what we do here is simple. We take real history, real mythology, real human lives from long ago, and we tell them slowly, quietly, the way someone might tell you a story by a dying fire on a cold night, back before television, back before anyone worried about being entertained every second. If that sounds like something you'd like more of, there's a subscribe button somewhere near this video, and I'd be glad to have you stick around for more nights like this one. No pressure though. Right now, all you need to do is relax and listen. All right. Let your eyes get heavy if they want to. I'll do the rest. There's something strange about Hades, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. Out of all the gods on Mount Olympus, or rather, not on Mount Olympus, since Hades almost never went there, he is probably the most misunderstood figure in the entire Greek pantheon. Ask most people today who Hades is, and they'll tell you he's the Greek version of the devil. Red skin, pitchfork, fire, evil laugh. That image comes largely from later retellings, from cartoons, from movies that needed a villain and borrowed his name because it sounded suitably dark. But if you actually sit with the ancient sources, the real hymns, the real plays, the pottery paintings that have survived nearly 3,000 years, a very different figure starts to emerge. Not a monster, not a trickster, not even, most of the time, a villain. Hades was the god of the dead, yes. But being god of the dead in the ancient Greek mind was not the same thing as being evil. Death, to the Greeks, was not sin. It was not punishment for wrongdoing, at least not automatically. Death was simply the next room in the house of existence, and Hades was the quiet, serious figure who kept that room in order. He didn't kill people. He didn't tempt them into wrongdoing. He didn't even usually leave his own home to interfere with the living world. In a pantheon full of gods behaving badly, gods who turned into animals to chase mortal women, gods who threw tantrums that caused earthquakes and famines, gods who meddled endlessly in human wars out of pride or jealousy, Hades mostly just stayed home. He ruled his kingdom with a strange kind of stillness, an authority that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. And that's really the heart of what makes him so interesting to spend a quiet evening thinking about. He was feared deeply by nearly everyone in the ancient world. Sailors avoided saying his name before a voyage. Farmers whispered euphemisms when they spoke of the underworld. And yet, when you look closely at the myths, at the way ordinary Greek families lived alongside the idea of him, you find something almost tender. A god who fell in love, awkwardly and permanently, with a girl gathering flowers in a meadow. A god who kept his word, even to heroes who tried to trick him. A god associated, strangely enough, not just with death but with the wealth that comes up out of the earth, with the grain buried in the soil that becomes bread, with the metal drawn from mountains that becomes tools and coins. Tonight we're going to walk through his whole story slowly. Not rushed, not dramatized for shock value, just laid out the way the ancient Greeks themselves understood it, piece by piece, myth by myth, ritual by ritual. We'll go back to the moment he was born, swallowed whole by his own father. We'll follow him through the war against the Titans that reshaped the entire universe. We'll walk into his kingdom itself, through its rivers and gates and fields, and meet the strange officials who worked there. We'll spend real time with the story of Persephone, which is far more complicated and far sadder than the cartoon version most of us grew up with. We'll sit with ordinary Greek families as they buried their dead and tried to make peace with a god they would all eventually have to meet. And by the end, I think you'll understand why the Greeks feared him, and also why, in their own quiet way, they respected him more than almost anyone else in the sky, or in this case, under the earth. So let's begin, gently, the way all good bedtime stories should. Not with thunder, not with screaming, just with a sound most people from the ancient world would have known by heart. The sound of a stone lid being swallowed. A father who feared his own children long before Hades ruled anything, long before there was an underworld to rule. The world belonged to an older generation of gods called the Titans. And ruling over the Titans, ruling over everything that existed, was a being named Cronus. I want you to imagine for a moment what the universe looked like at that time, at least as the Greeks pictured it. There was Earth, wide and solid, personified as the goddess Gaia. There was sky above her, personified as the god Uranus. And out of their union came children, an entire first generation of powerful beings called Titans, 12 of them, along with a scattering of other monstrous offspring. Cronus was one of these Titan children, and he became the ruler of them all after doing something rather violent to his own father, which is a story for another quiet evening. What matters for tonight is that Cronus took his sister, Rhea, as his wife, and together they began having children of their own. Here is where the story turns dark in a very human way, even though these are gods we're talking about. Cronus had heard a prophecy, the kind of warning that shows up again and again in mythology, saying that one of his own children would eventually overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father before him. And Cronus, terrified of losing his throne, decided he would not let that happen. So every time Rhea gave birth, Cronus took the infant from her arms and swallowed it whole. Imagine being Rhea in that palace, somewhere in the vague, dreamlike geography the Greeks imagined for the age of the Titans. Imagine going through pregnancy after pregnancy, feeling that same flutter of hope every mother has felt since the beginning of time, only to watch your husband take the baby the moment it was born and swallow it down like a piece of fruit. This happened, according to the old stories, 5 times. 5 children swallowed. One of those children was a boy who would grow up, quite literally, inside the darkness of his father's body. That child's name was Hades. Now, we don't get a lot of detail in the ancient sources about what those years were like for the swallowed children, for the simple reason that the stories weren't really interested in it. Ancient myth tends to skip over the waiting and go straight to the turning point. But it's worth pausing here, just for a moment, to imagine it anyway, the way a storyteller by a fire might have paused. Somewhere inside Cronus, in whatever strange non-space swallowed gods occupied, existed Hestia, the eldest, goddess of the hearth; Demeter, goddess of grain and harvest; Hera, who would later become queen of the gods; Poseidon, who would come to rule the sea; and Hades, who would come to rule the dead, quietly waiting there before he had even had the chance to open his eyes to the ordinary world. Rhea, understandably, could not bear to lose a 6th child the same way. So when she became pregnant one final time, she went to her own mother, Gaia, and to Uranus for advice. And together they helped her come up with a plan. When the time came, Rhea traveled to the island of Crete, away from Cronus, and she gave birth in secret, in a cave on Mount Ida, or in some tellings Mount Dicte. That child was Zeus. And here comes one of the more oddly domestic details in all of Greek myth. Rhea needed to trick her husband into thinking he had swallowed the baby, so she wrapped a large stone in swaddling cloth, the same soft cloth you would wrap any newborn in, and she presented it to Cronus. And Cronus, apparently not looking too closely, or perhaps not wanting to look too closely, swallowed the stone whole, believing it was his son. Meanwhile, the real infant Zeus was hidden away on Crete, raised in secret by nymphs, fed on goat's milk, guarded by young warriors called the Curetes, who were said to have clashed their spears against their shields whenever the baby cried, so that Cronus would never hear the sound and grow suspicious. It's such a strange, tender little detail to have survived thousands of years, this image of armored men dancing and banging their weapons together just to drown out a baby's crying. There's something almost lullaby-like about it if you think about it the right way. A whole island conspiring quietly to protect one small child. Zeus grew up on that island, away from his father's court, away from the rest of his swallowed siblings, and by the time he reached adulthood, he had become strong enough and clever enough to do something about the situation. With the help of a goddess named Meadow, whose name literally means cunning or wisdom, Zeus arranged for Cronus to be given a mixture that made him vomit up everything he had swallowed. And here is the moment that concerns our story tonight most directly. Out came the stone that had stood in for Zeus. And out came, one by one, in the reverse order they had been swallowed, Hades, Poseidon, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia. Grown adults, fully formed, stepping back out into the world they had never truly experienced, blinking, so to speak, into the same light their younger brother had grown up under on that quiet island. It's worth sitting with that image for a second. Hades, arguably the oldest of the male gods in that generation, was in some strange sense the youngest to actually experience the world, having spent his entire early existence in darkness inside his father's body. Maybe that's part of why the underworld never seemed to frighten him the way it frightened everyone else. He had already spent an unimaginable stretch of time in a place with no light at all. Once free, these newly liberated gods, now numbering 6 along with Zeus, understood there was really only one path forward. Cronus was not going to simply step aside and let his children live in peace, not after everything he had done to prevent exactly this outcome. War was coming, and it would not be a small one. It would be a war that reshaped the entire structure of the cosmos, and it needed a name grand enough to match. The Greeks called it the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, and it's where we're headed next. Let's pause here for just a moment, though, and think about what all of this means, quietly, the way you might think about an old family story your grandparents told you as a child. Every civilization has had to answer the question of where the gods or God came from, and what kind of family drama might exist behind the order of the universe. The Greeks answered it with jealousy, fear, and a father who could not let go of power even at the cost of his own children. It's a very human answer, dressed up in divine clothing, and it tells us something about how the Greeks saw their gods from the very beginning. Not as distant, perfect, untouchable beings, but as characters with flaws, fears, and family troubles not so different from anyone sitting by a hearth fire on a cold night, wondering about their own children's futures. Now, let's go inside that war and watch Hades find the very thing that would eventually make him a king. The war that rebuilt the sky. I want you to imagine standing on a hillside somewhere in ancient Thessaly, in that hazy, half-remembered region of Greek myth called Mount Othrys, where the Titans made their stronghold. From here, you'd be able to see, far in the distance, Mount Olympus, where the younger gods, the ones the Greeks would come to call the Olympians, had gathered their own forces. Between these two mountains lay 10 years of war. 10 years. That's how long the ancient sources say the Titanomachy dragged on, an entire decade of cosmic struggle between two generations of divine beings, each side led by powerful figures, each side unwilling to yield. The Titans, ancient and vast, had strength on their side, the accumulated weight of having ruled since the beginning of the world. The Olympians, younger, had something else. They had cleverness, alliances, and eventually, allies from an even older and stranger part of creation. Zeus, understanding that raw force alone might not be enough, went down into the deepest parts of the earth, into a place called Tartarus, which lies so far below the surface that, according to Hesiod, an anvil dropped from the sky would take 9 days to reach the earth, and another 9 days falling from the earth would be needed to reach Tartarus below it. Down there, imprisoned long ago by Uranus and then again by Cronus, were beings almost too strange to describe easily. The Cyclopes, giant one-eyed craftsmen, and the Hecatoncheires, 100-handed giants of tremendous strength. Zeus freed them, and in gratitude, the Cyclopes forged gifts for the young gods who would need them most in the war ahead. For Zeus, they made the thunderbolt, the weapon that would define him for the rest of mythology, the crack of lightning across the sky becoming forever associated with his anger and his authority. For Poseidon, they made the trident, a weapon that could shake the earth and stir the sea. And for Hades, quietly, without much fanfare in most versions of the myth, they made something entirely different from a weapon at all. They made him a helmet. This is one of my favorite small details in the entire mythology, honestly, and it says so much about the character Hades would become. His brothers received weapons of raw, visible power, a bolt of lightning that could split the sky, a trident that could crack open the ground. Hades received a helmet of invisibility, a cap that could make its wearer completely unseen. Some ancient sources call it the cap of invisibility, others the helm of darkness, and it was said to have been made from the hide of a dog. It didn't roar or explode. It simply let its wearer vanish from sight entirely, allowing them to move unnoticed, to watch, to act without being observed. There's a real philosophical difference embedded in these three gifts. If you think about it slowly, the way you might turn over an old coin in your hand. Zeus's power was loud and immediate, visible to everyone, a display of force from the sky. Poseidon's power was vast and physical, capable of literally reshaping the land and sea. But Hades's power was quiet, hidden, working from the shadows rather than the spotlight. Even at the very beginning of his story, before he had a kingdom, before he had a name that people would fear to speak, Hades was already being defined as the god who worked unseen, who didn't need to be witnessed to be effective. During the war itself, Hades wore that helmet and used it, according to some later accounts, to sneak into the camp of the Titans and destroy their weapons while remaining completely invisible, sabotaging them from within before the final battles were even fought. Imagine that scene for a moment if you can, the way an old storyteller might paint it slowly with words. A figure nobody could see moving silently through an enemy camp at night, disabling their armor, breaking their spears, undermining an entire army's readiness for battle without a single soul ever catching a glimpse of him. No shouting, no violence in the traditional sense, just quiet, patient sabotage carried out in total darkness. That is, in many ways, the essential character of Hades distilled into a single mythic image. The war eventually turned in favor of the younger gods, with Zeus hurling thunderbolts from the sky, Poseidon striking with his trident, the Hecatoncheires hurling massive boulders with their 100 hands each, and Hades moving unseen through the chaos. The Titans were eventually overwhelmed. Cronus and most of the other Titans were defeated and imprisoned deep within Tartarus, the same dark pit from which the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires had once been freed, guarded now by those same 100-handed giants who owed their freedom to the young gods who had rescued them. And with the Titans defeated, the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, needed to decide how to divide up the vast domain their victory had won them. According to the most common version of the myth, they didn't sit down and negotiate this the way a modern family might divide an inheritance. Instead, they drew lots. 3 lots cast between the 3 brothers, deciding who would rule what. It's a detail that always strikes me as strangely fair, almost democratic in its randomness, for a mythology otherwise so full of favoritism and family drama. Zeus drew the sky and became king of the gods, ruler of Mount Olympus and all the heavens above. Poseidon drew the sea, becoming lord of the waters, the tides, the storms that could sink ships or calm to glassy stillness in a single afternoon. And Hades drew the underworld. Now, it's worth pausing here to correct something that a lot of modern retellings get slightly wrong, something that matters if we want to understand who Hades really was to the ancient Greeks. Losing the draw for the underworld was not, in the ancient mind, a punishment or even particularly bad luck. The earth itself, the middle ground where mortals lived their lives, was considered common territory, belonging to no single god exclusively, though many gods had influence there. What Hades received was not simply darkness and death. He received an entire realm, vast, orderly, filled with its own laws, its own geography, its own population that only grew larger with each passing year, since after all, everyone eventually died. In a very real sense, Hades became the ruler of more permanent territory than either of his brothers. Kingdoms on earth rise and fall. Empires crumble. Even the sea's borders shift with the ages. But everyone, without exception, mortal king and humble farmer alike, would eventually come to live within Hades's domain. So while Zeus ruled from a golden palace atop a mountain visible to everyone below, and Poseidon ruled from beneath crashing waves that ships crossed every single day, Hades withdrew, almost immediately, into the quiet dark beneath the world, and he rarely, if ever, came back up. Let's follow him down there now, gently, the way you'd follow a lantern through an unfamiliar hallway at night, and see exactly what kind of kingdom this quiet, helmet-wearing god built for himself in the depths. The geography of the dark. Before we go any further, I want you to imagine you are standing at the very edge of the world as the ancient Greeks understood it. Not the whole spherical Earth we know today from photographs taken in space, but the flatter, more mysterious version the Greeks pictured, ringed by a great river called Oceanus that flowed endlessly around everything, with lands growing stranger and more distant the further you traveled from the familiar coastlines of the Aegean. Somewhere out past the edges of ordinary geography, or in other versions of the myth, simply straight down beneath the earth itself, lay the entrance to the underworld. The Greeks didn't imagine a single tidy doorway, the way we might picture a door with a knocker on it. Instead, there were several places across the Mediterranean world where people believed you could physically access the entrance to Hades's realm, deep caves and volcanic fissures, where the air smelled of sulfur and the ground felt uncertain beneath your feet. One of the most famous was at a place called Cape Tainaran, at the southern tip of the Peloponnese, where a cave was said to open directly into the underworld's depths. Another was near a place called Avernus, in Italy, a crater lake so still and sulfuric that birds supposedly refused to fly over it, its very name meaning in Greek without birds. Now, imagine actually making that journey, the way heroes in a handful of the old stories did. You would walk, or in some versions be ferried, into darkness that seemed to have no natural end, further and further from any hint of sunlight, until eventually you reached a wide, slow-moving river. This was one of 5 rivers said to run through Hades's realm, and each one had its own particular character, its own quiet symbolism that ancient audiences would have recognized instantly. The first and most famous was the Styx, a river so sacred that even the gods themselves swore their most unbreakable oaths upon its name. Its waters were said to flow with a kind of dark, cold power, and a god who broke an oath sworn on the Styx faced a terrible punishment, losing the ability to speak or drink ambrosia for an entire year, and being cast out from the company of the other gods for 9 more years after that. Imagine that level of seriousness attached to a single body of water, a river so binding that even beings of near limitless power feared crossing its word. Then there was the Acheron, sometimes called the River of Woe, often described as the primary river that souls had to cross to enter the underworld proper. There was the Cocytus, the River of Wailing, said to be fed by the tears of those who had wronged others in life. There was the Phlegethon, a river of fire, burning endlessly, its flames never consuming the banks it flowed past. And finally there was the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, whose waters, if drunk, would erase all memory of one's former life entirely. I want you to sit with that last one for a moment, the Lethe, because I think it captures something deeply human about how the Greeks imagined death. It wasn't enough for them to imagine an afterlife that simply continued consciousness forever, unchanged. They imagined that part of moving on required forgetting, a gentle erasing of the pain, the worry, the specific weight of a life once lived, so that whatever came next could begin without being crushed under the memory of everything that came before. There's something almost merciful in that idea, if you think about it slowly enough, the way a tired mind might finally let go of a difficult day right before falling asleep. To cross these rivers, especially the Acheron, souls needed the help of a particular figure, an old ferryman named Charon. Charon appears again and again in ancient art, usually depicted as a grim, weathered old man, sometimes with a scraggly beard, poling a rough wooden boat across dark water. And Charon, notably, did not work for free. This is why, in ancient Greek burial customs, families would place a small coin, often called an obol, either on the tongue or over the eyes of their dead. This coin was meant as payment for Charon's toll, a fare for the crossing into the world beyond. Think about what that meant for ordinary families going about their grief in real, everyday terms. When someone died in ancient Greece, the family didn't just mourn quietly and move on to funeral logistics the way we might today with a phone call to a funeral home. There were specific, practical steps believed necessary to make sure the deceased could actually complete their journey properly. Wash the body. Anoint it with oil. Dress it in fine cloth. Place a coin in the mouth or over the eyes. Without that coin, tradition held, a soul might be left wandering the near shore of the Acheron for 100 years, unable to cross, stuck in a kind of restless, homeless waiting between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Imagine being a parent in ancient Athens, having just lost a child to illness, something devastatingly common in the ancient world, and in the middle of unbearable grief, still needing to remember this small, practical detail. A coin, placed carefully, so that your child would not be left wandering alone on a riverbank in the dark for a century. There's something in that detail that connects across thousands of years directly to anyone who has ever grieved. The desire, even amid overwhelming sorrow, to make sure the person you loved was cared for, was given what they needed for whatever came next. Once across the river, souls would arrive at the gates of the underworld proper, and here they would meet perhaps the most famous resident of Hades's kingdom aside from Hades himself. A massive, three-headed dog, Cerberus, whose job was not, as many people assume, to keep souls out. Cerberus's job was to keep souls in. He would greet arriving souls calmly enough, even is said to have enjoyed being fed honey cakes by the recently deceased, a treat left by grieving families for exactly this purpose. But the moment any soul tried to turn around and leave, to slip back across the river toward the world of the living, Cerberus's friendly demeanor vanished entirely, and he became an immovable, three-headed guardian, ensuring that whoever entered the realm of the dead remained there. Past Cerberus, the underworld opened up into distinct regions, each with its own character, its own population, its own atmosphere. There was the asphodel meadows, a vast, gray, quiet field of asphodel flowers, described in ancient sources almost like a kind of neutral holding ground, where the majority of ordinary souls, neither particularly heroic nor particularly wicked, spent their afterlife in a soft, dim, unremarkable peace. Imagine an entire field stretching further than the eye could see, filled with countless souls wandering slowly among pale flowers, not suffering, not celebrating, simply existing in quiet continuation. There was also Tartarus, which we mentioned earlier as the prison of the Titans, but which also served as a place of punishment for particularly wicked mortal souls, a deep, harsh pit reserved for those who had committed truly severe crimes against the gods or against the natural order of things. And there was Elysium, sometimes called the Elysian Fields, or in its most exclusive form, the Isles of the Blessed, a paradise reserved for heroes, for those favored by the gods, for souls who had lived with particular virtue or achieved particular greatness. We'll spend more time in each of these places a little later tonight, because each one deserves its own careful visit. And ruling over all of it, from a palace built somewhere deep within this vast underground kingdom, sat Hades, alongside a queen whose story is one of the most quietly haunting in the entire mythology. Let's go inside that palace now, and let's finally meet her. A girl in a meadow I want you to picture, for a moment, a warm afternoon somewhere in the region of Sicily, or in other versions of the story, in the fields around Eleusis near Athens, though the exact location changes depending on which ancient source you're reading, which itself tells you something about how widely beloved and widely retold this particular myth was across the Greek world. In this meadow, wildflowers grow in loose, uneven clusters, the kind you might find along any country roadside even today if you know where to look. Poppies, crocuses, violets, the soft purple and yellow blooms that seem to appear every spring without anyone quite planting them. A young goddess named Persephone, daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, is gathering these flowers with a group of companions, other nymphs and young goddesses enjoying an ordinary, sunlit afternoon. There is nothing dramatic happening yet, nothing to suggest the meadow is anything other than what it appears to be. Just a girl picking flowers, the way countless girls across countless centuries have done on countless warm afternoons. Then Persephone notices something unusual. A flower unlike any she's seen before, sometimes described in the ancient sources as a narcissus, remarkably beautiful, glowing with an almost unnatural fragrance, growing slightly apart from the others. She reaches for it, and the moment her fingers close around its stem, the earth splits open beneath her. This wasn't an accident of nature. According to the myth, the flower had been placed there deliberately, at the request of Zeus, as a kind of lure, because Hades, ruling alone in his quiet underground kingdom, had told his brother he wished to take Persephone as his wife. Zeus, notably, did not consult Demeter about this arrangement at all, a detail that matters enormously to how the rest of this story unfolds, and gave his consent on his brother's behalf. Whether you read this as a marriage arranged through customary practices, similar to real arranged marriages common throughout the ancient world, or as something closer to an abduction, depends heavily on which ancient telling you're reading. And honestly, on how you personally choose to interpret it. Both readings exist, side by side in the historical record, and it's worth sitting with that ambiguity rather than rushing past it toward a simple answer. What we do know, from the version of the story preserved in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, one of the oldest and most detailed sources we have for this entire myth, is that the earth opened, and Hades emerged from below, driving a golden chariot pulled by immortal, dark-maned horses. He seized Persephone, and despite her cries, which the hymn describes as being heard by her father Zeus and by the sun god Helios, but by almost no one else, she was pulled down into the earth, and the ground closed seamlessly behind her, as though nothing at all had happened. I want you to imagine the meadow after this moment, the way an old storyteller might linger there before moving the story forward. The other companions, Persephone's friends, look around and find her gone, without explanation, without a trace, just an empty patch of grass where a young goddess had been standing moments before, and scattered flowers falling from a basket no one is holding anymore. Meanwhile, up above, in the ordinary world where mortals lived out their lives, Demeter began to search. This is really where the emotional heart of this myth lives, and it's worth spending real time here, quietly, because it's a mother's grief we're talking about, dressed in divine clothing but recognizable to absolutely anyone who has ever lost someone and searched for them anyway, even knowing, deep down, that the searching might not bring them back. Demeter wandered the earth for 9 days and 9 nights, according to the hymn, refusing food, refusing rest, carrying 2 torches to light her way through the darkness, calling out her daughter's name across every field, every mountain, every village she passed. She spoke to no one, ate nothing, and slept, if she slept at all, only briefly and without comfort. Eventually, she learned the truth, first from Hecate, a goddess associated with crossroads and magic, who had heard Persephone's cries but hadn't seen who had taken her, and then more fully from Helios, the sun god, who sees everything that happens beneath his light during the day, and was therefore able to tell Demeter exactly what had occurred. Her daughter had been taken by Hades, with Zeus's blessing, down into the underworld to become his wife. Demeter's response to this news is one of the more remarkable moments in all of Greek mythology, because rather than simply grieving quietly or accepting the situation as an arrangement made among gods, she did something that affected the entire world. Demeter, remember, was the goddess of the harvest, of grain, of the fertile earth that fed every mortal being alive. In her grief and her anger at Zeus for allowing this to happen without her consent, she withdrew her blessing from the earth entirely. Crops stopped growing. Fields that should have been green and full turned barren and gray. Livestock grew thin. Famine spread across the mortal world, and for the first time, humans faced the very real possibility of complete extinction, not through any war or plague, but simply because the goddess who made the earth fertile had stopped doing her job, consumed entirely by grief for her missing child. I want you to sit with the scale of that decision for a moment, quietly, the way you might sit with a difficult thought right before sleep. This wasn't a small act of protest. Demeter was, in effect, willing to let the entire world starve rather than simply move on from her daughter's disappearance. It's an almost frightening depth of grief, but it's also, if you think about it honestly, deeply, achingly human. Anyone who has grieved deeply knows that feeling, that sense that the ordinary functioning of the world should stop, should acknowledge somehow that something enormous has been lost, even when the world, indifferent, keeps turning anyway. Demeter simply had the divine power to actually make the world stop turning, at least for a while. Eventually, with humanity on the brink of starvation and no sacrifices being made to any of the gods because there were no mortals left healthy enough to make them, Zeus was forced to intervene. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, down into the underworld to negotiate Persephone's return. And this is where we arrive at the detail most people already know, at least in outline, even if they've never read the full myth. Hades, upon learning he would have to release Persephone, agreed, but before she left, he offered her something to eat, a small handful of pomegranate seeds. In some versions, she ate them willingly. In others, she was tricked into eating them, not realizing the consequence of doing so. But either way, the outcome was the same, and it mattered enormously in the logic of ancient Greek myth. Anyone who ate food in the underworld became bound to it permanently. By eating those pomegranate seeds, Persephone had tied a part of herself to Hades's kingdom, whether she fully understood what she was doing or not. When Demeter learned of this, her joy at her daughter's return was immediately tempered by this new complication. A compromise had to be reached, and Zeus, once again stepping in to mediate between these two powerful, grieving, angry figures, arranged an agreement that has shaped how people have understood the changing seasons ever since. Persephone would spend part of the year, most commonly described as a third of the year, though some versions differ slightly on the exact fraction, down in the underworld with Hades as his wife and queen. And she would spend the remaining months back on the surface with her mother. And here, finally, is the explanation the ancient Greeks offered for why the seasons change, told not as a scientific fact, but as an emotional truth wrapped in the shape of a myth. When Persephone descends into the underworld each year to be with Hades, Demeter's grief returns, and she withdraws her blessing from the earth once more, and the world grows cold and barren, and we call this season winter. And when Persephone rises back to the surface each year to be reunited with her mother, Demeter's joy floods back into the earth, and the world blooms again with warmth and green growing things, and we call this season spring, followed by the fullness of summer's harvest. Let's pause here and think about this slowly, the way you might turn over a smooth stone in your palm before setting it down. Every single year in this telling, winter exists because a mother is missing her daughter. Every single year, spring exists because that same mother has been reunited with her, however temporarily, however bittersweetly, knowing the whole time that the separation will inevitably come again. There's an aching, cyclical honesty to that idea that I think explains why this particular myth has survived, retold, and beloved for well over 2,500 years. It takes something as impersonal as the changing of the seasons and gives it an entirely human emotional shape. Winter isn't just cold weather. Winter is grief, returning right on schedule, every single year, the way grief so often does for anyone who has lost someone they love. And what of Persephone herself in all of this? It's worth noting, gently, that later traditions, particularly those connected to religious practices at Eleusis, near Athens, came to view her not simply as a victim of circumstance, but as a genuine queen of the underworld, powerful in her own right, someone mortals could pray to, someone associated not just with being taken, but with genuinely ruling alongside Hades over the vast population of the dead. She is sometimes shown in ancient art seated beside Hades on an equal throne, holding a scepter of her own, receiving offerings and prayers just as her husband did. Whatever the exact nature of how their marriage began, and the ancient sources themselves seem uncertain or unwilling to settle that question definitively. The marriage that followed appears, in most later mythology, to have settled into something resembling genuine partnership, two rulers governing a vast and orderly kingdom together. We'll come back to Persephone again a little later tonight, when we talk about the mysteries at Eleusis and what ordinary Greeks actually believed about death and the possibility of a better afterlife. But for now, let's leave the Meadow behind, and let's go meet the god himself in his own home, and see what kind of a husband and what kind of a king Hades actually was said to be. The quiet king and his household, if you were to travel into the deepest part of Hades's kingdom, past the rivers, past Cerberus, past the fields of asphodel, you would eventually arrive at a palace. The ancient sources don't describe it in the kind of loving architectural detail they sometimes lavish on Zeus's golden halls atop Olympus, and I think that absence of description is itself telling. Hades's home is usually described simply as vast, dark, and many-gated, a place built more for permanence and order than for splendor or show. I want you to imagine walking through those gates, the way a newly arrived soul might have imagined it, or the way a rare mortal visitor, one of the handful of heroes who managed to travel there and return, might have described it afterward around a fire to eager, half-frightened listeners. Cold stone corridors. The distant, echoing murmur of countless voices, the accumulated whispers of every soul who had ever died, filling the air like a low, constant hum. And at the center of it all, a throne room where Hades sat, usually depicted in ancient art holding a scepter, sometimes accompanied by a key, symbolizing his authority to lock the gates of his kingdom and ensure that none who entered could easily leave. Hades is almost never shown in ancient art the way later, more theatrical traditions would eventually depict him, with horns or flames or a demonic appearance. Instead, ancient vase paintings and sculptures typically show him as a mature, bearded man, dignified and serious, often seated, sometimes holding a cornucopia, a horn overflowing with abundance, which might seem strange for a god of death until you remember his other, less obvious role in Greek religious thought. Hades, alongside being Lord of the Dead, was also closely associated with the earth's hidden wealth, everything valuable that comes from beneath the ground. Precious metals, gold, silver, iron, all mined from deep within the earth, were considered to belong, in a sense, to Hades's domain, since they came from the same depths where he ruled. This connection was so strong that the Romans, when they later absorbed Greek mythology into their own religious framework, gave Hades's Roman equivalent, Pluto, a name that directly derives from the Greek word for wealth, plautos. Even in Greek, one of Hades's alternate names or epithets was Plauton, meaning the rich one or the giver of wealth. Think about the logic behind that association for a moment, quietly, the way you might turn over an idea slowly before sleep takes you. Grain planted in the ground has to essentially die, has to be buried, before it can grow again into something that feeds an entire family through the winter. Precious metals lie hidden beneath the soil until they're dug up and transformed into wealth. In the ancient agricultural mind, there was a deep, almost poetic connection between the earth's darkness and the earth's abundance, between burial and growth, between what seems lost and what eventually returns transformed. Hades, ruling the depths, ruled both aspects of this cycle at once. He was the god of what disappears into the ground, and quietly, also the god of what comes back up out of it, whether that was springtime grain, precious ore, or, in the case of his own wife, a goddess who returned to the surface every single year. Now, despite his fearsome reputation among mortals, the ancient sources are notably consistent about one thing regarding Hades's character. He was not, generally speaking, portrayed as cruel, capricious, or unjust, the way several of the Olympian gods frequently were in their dealings with mortals and with each other. Hades operated according to firm, unbending rules, and he expected everyone, gods and mortals alike, to respect those rules in turn. Once a soul entered his kingdom, it stayed there. Once an oath was sworn upon the sacred waters of the Styx, it could not be broken without severe consequence. Hades wasn't interested in favoritism, in petty jealousy, in the kind of dramatic interpersonal conflicts that fill so many other Greek myths involving the Olympian gods. He simply maintained order in a realm that, by its very nature, needed order more than almost any other part of the cosmos, since it held within it every single soul that had ever lived and died. This reputation for fairness, strange as it might sound applied to a god of death, actually made him somewhat respected, even trusted, in certain contexts. There's a telling detail in several ancient sources describing Hades as one of the few gods who could not be bribed, flattered, or manipulated the way mortals so often tried to manipulate the other Olympians through elaborate sacrifices and flattering hymns. Death and the rules governing the afterlife simply were what they were, regardless of how many bulls you sacrificed or how eloquently you prayed. That said, the myths do preserve a small handful of stories where mortals, through extraordinary circumstances, managed to bend Hades's rules, if only briefly. And these stories are some of the most beautiful and most tragic in the entire mythological tradition. Let's spend some time with them now, quietly, because they tell us something important about how the Greeks understood the boundary between life and death, and about whether that boundary could ever, even briefly, be crossed. Those who walked into the dark and came back, I want you to imagine, for a moment, a young musician named Orpheus, standing at the edge of the underworld, his lyre held tightly in his hands, having just lost his wife, Eurydice, to a snake bite on their wedding day. Most people, faced with that kind of grief, simply grieve. Orpheus, whose music was said to be so beautiful it could charm wild animals, move rivers, and even convince stones to weep, decided he would do something almost no mortal had ever successfully attempted. He decided he would go down into the underworld itself and ask Hades to give his wife back. Imagine the journey he must have made, alone, carrying nothing but his lyre, walking past Cerberus, who, according to the myth, was so moved by the sorrowful beauty of Orpheus's music that he simply lay down and let him pass, the three great heads drooping in something like a trance. Imagine crossing the Styx, with Charon so entranced by the music that he ferried Orpheus across without even asking for the customary coin. And finally, imagine standing before the throne of Hades and Persephone themselves, and instead of pleading with words, simply playing. The ancient sources describe the effect of that music as remarkable, even among gods who had heard every kind of prayer, every kind of bargain, every kind of desperate request from mortals throughout the ages. It's said that even the eternally punished souls of Tartarus, whom we'll meet shortly, paused their endless torments to listen. It's said that the wheel of Ixion, spinning without rest, briefly stopped turning. It's said that Sisyphus, forever pushing his boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down, sat down on the stone itself, just to listen. And it's said that Persephone, who understood better than almost any other figure in the entire mythology what it meant to be taken from someone you loved and separated across an unbridgeable distance, wept. And Hades, moved by his wife's tears, and perhaps by something in the music itself that touched even his famously unmoved heart, agreed to release Eurydice back to the world of the living. But he set one condition. Orpheus was to walk ahead of Eurydice, back up through the dark passage toward the surface world, and under no circumstances was he to turn around and look at her until they had both fully reached the sunlight above. It sounds simple enough, doesn't it? The kind of instruction you might barely register as difficult. Just don't look back. Keep walking. And yet, as they climbed in near total darkness, with only the faint hope of Eurydice's footsteps somewhere behind him as proof she was actually there at all, doubt crept into Orpheus's mind. What if Hades had tricked him? What if he had made this entire arduous climb for nothing, and there was no one following him at all? The silence behind him in that oppressive dark must have felt unbearable. And just as he reached the very edge of the upper world, just as sunlight was beginning to touch his face for the first time since he descended, he turned around. And Eurydice, who had not yet stepped fully into the light herself, was pulled back down into the darkness, gone this time forever, with no second chance offered. It's one of the most quietly devastating endings in all of Greek mythology, precisely because it's so understandable. Orpheus doesn't fail because of malice or foolishness in any dramatic sense. He fails because of something achingly human, an inability to simply trust in something he cannot see or verify, a need for certainty that ultimately costs him the very thing he was trying to protect. This myth, more than almost any other involving Hades, tells us something important about how the ancient Greeks understood death's finality and about the rules governing his kingdom. Hades could be moved, could show mercy, even genuine compassion, but the underlying order of his realm remained, in the end, unbendable. Death was not something that could simply be undone through cleverness or beauty alone. It required something else, some final act of trust or faith that mortals, being mortals, often struggled to provide. Orpheus was not the only figure to make this journey, though. Let's spend a little time with a few others, since each visit to Hades's kingdom reveals a slightly different facet of who this quiet god actually was. Heracles, during the course of his famous 12 labors, was tasked with his final and arguably most difficult challenge, capturing Cerberus himself and bringing the great three-headed dog up to the surface world, alive, without weapons, and returning him afterward unharmed. This required Heracles to travel into the underworld and directly petition Hades for permission. And notably, Hades agreed on one condition, that Heracles use no weapons at all, relying purely on his own strength to subdue the beast. Heracles succeeded, wrestling Cerberus into submission with his bare hands, dragging the enormous, terrified, snarling creature up into the sunlight to complete his labor, before returning him safely to the underworld exactly as he had promised. It's a small detail, easy to miss, but it reinforces something we've already noticed. Hades, even when dealing with the most famous strongman in Greek mythology, expected fairness and expected his conditions to be honored. And Heracles, to his credit, honored them. There's also the story of Theseus and Persephone, two heroes who, in a moment of rather astonishing overconfidence, decided they would travel into the underworld together in order to kidnap Persephone for Persephone to marry, having apparently decided, after Theseus had already helped Persephone attempt to abduct Helen of Sparta in an earlier adventure, that this was simply the kind of ambitious project their friendship specialized in. Hades, upon learning of their plan, which frankly reads as one of the more reckless ideas in all of Greek myth, did not respond with violent rage the way one might expect a betrayed and threatened king to respond. Instead, he responded with something closer to grim, patient irony. He invited them to sit down, offering them seats at his table as though welcoming honored guests. And the moment they sat down, they found they could not get back up. The chairs in most versions of the myth were enchanted, fusing to their bodies, trapping them there in the underworld indefinitely, a punishment that fit their crime with a kind of poetic precision that feels almost darkly humorous when you sit with it for a moment. They wanted to sit as rulers alongside the king of the underworld, so Hades let them sit forever. Theseus was eventually rescued by Heracles during his labor to capture Cerberus, but Persephone, in most versions, was left behind permanently, a lasting reminder that Hades's hospitality, while genuine, was not something to be abused. And finally, there's Odysseus, hero of the Odyssey, who traveled to the edge of the underworld not to rescue anyone or steal anything, but simply to seek guidance, speaking with the shades of the dead, including his own mother, who had died of grief while he was away at war, and the great prophet Tiresias, who offered him crucial advice about how to survive the remainder of his long journey home. Odysseus doesn't fully enter Hades's kingdom in this story, so much as summon the dead to the threshold, performing rituals involving the blood of sacrificed animals, which the shades needed to drink before they could speak clearly to him. It's a quieter, sadder visit than the others, filled less with grand bargains and more with the simple ache of a son speaking to his mother's ghost, learning for the first time that she had died while he was away, unable to be there, unable even to properly say goodbye. Each of these stories, taken together, paints a picture of a god who governed his realm with consistent, if occasionally negotiable, rules. He could be moved by music, by strength honestly demonstrated, by respect properly shown. But he could not be tricked, could not be overpowered, and would not tolerate genuine disrespect toward the order he maintained. It's a strikingly consistent character for a figure who appears relatively rarely, compared to gods like Zeus or Athena, throughout the wider body of Greek mythology. Now, let's go a little deeper into his kingdom, into the parts reserved specifically for judgment, and meet some of the individuals whose punishments have become so famous they've entered our everyday language even today, thousands of years later, often without people even realizing where those phrases originally came from. The judges and the judged deep within the underworld, beyond the rivers, beyond the fields of asphodel where most ordinary souls spent their quiet, unremarkable afterlife, there existed a system of judgment. Souls arriving in Hades's kingdom did not simply wander in and settle wherever they pleased. According to most traditions, they were evaluated, sorted according to how they had lived, by a panel of judges appointed specifically for this purpose. Three figures most commonly appear in this role across the ancient sources. Minos, the legendary king of Crete, famous in life for his wisdom and his connection to the labyrinth and the Minotaur. Rhadamanthys, his brother, similarly renowned for justice and fairness during his own mortal life. And Aeacus, a king known for his piety and his close relationship with the gods. All three had been mortal kings during their lives on earth, renowned specifically for their wisdom and fairness. And upon their deaths, they were granted the honor, or perhaps the burden, of continuing that work eternally, judging the souls of the newly dead and determining where each one belonged. Imagine standing before these three figures after death, the way an ordinary Greek farmer or merchant or mother might have imagined it while still alive, lying awake at night wondering what judgment awaited them. There was no elaborate courtroom drama in most tellings, no long list of accusations read aloud. The judgment seems to have functioned more like a quiet, almost bureaucratic sorting process, determining whether a soul's life had been marked by particular virtue, particular wickedness, or simply the ordinary mixture of both that describes most human lives ever lived. Most souls, the judges determined, belonged in the asphodel meadows, that quiet gray field we mentioned earlier, neither reward nor punishment, simply continuation. But some souls received a different sentence, reserved specifically for those who had committed offenses so severe, usually offenses directly against the gods themselves rather than merely against other mortals, that ordinary continuation in the meadows was considered insufficient. These souls were sent to Tartarus, and it's here that we find some of the most memorable, and honestly some of the most darkly imaginative, punishments in the entire body of Greek mythology. Let's meet a few of them slowly, the way you might read through an old book of parables before falling asleep. First, there's Sisyphus, whose name has become so thoroughly embedded in our modern language that we describe any endless, pointless task as Sisyphean without most people even realizing the reference. Sisyphus, during his mortal life, had been a clever, cunning king, known for tricking and outsmarting nearly everyone he encountered, mortal and divine alike. In one version of his story, he actually managed to trick Thanatos, the personification of death itself, chaining him up so that no one on earth could die at all for a period of time, a situation that caused considerable chaos until the gods intervened to free Thanatos and restore the natural order. In another version, Sisyphus tricked Hades himself, convincing him to allow a brief return to the surface world under some pretense, and then simply refusing to come back, living out an extended additional lifespan before finally being forcibly returned to the underworld by Hermes. For all of this cleverness and defiance, Sisyphus was given an eternal punishment perfectly suited to his character. He was made to push an enormous boulder up a steep hill, and every single time he neared the top, exhausted, straining, believing for just a moment that he had finally succeeded, the boulder would slip from his grasp and roll back down to the bottom, forcing him to begin the entire exhausting climb again. Forever. No end point. No final success. Just endless, repetitive labor with no possibility of completion. There's something worth sitting with quietly in this particular punishment, more than almost any other in Greek mythology, because it doesn't involve fire or torture in any traditional sense. It's simply the punishment of pointlessness itself, labor stripped of any meaning or resolution, repeated without end. Many people over the centuries have found this particular myth strangely relatable, even comforting in an odd way, as a metaphor for certain kinds of ordinary struggle, work that never seems to finish, effort that never seems to lead anywhere permanent, and yet must be continued anyway, day after day. Then there's Tantalus, another clever, or rather overly clever, mortal king, who committed one of the more shocking offenses in the entire mythology by attempting to test the gods' omniscience, serving them a meal made from his own son to see whether they would notice. The gods, naturally, noticed immediately and were horrified. Tantalus's punishment involved standing forever in a pool of water beneath a tree heavy with fruit, eternally thirsty and eternally hungry, and every time he reached for the fruit above him, the branches would pull just out of reach, and every time he bent down to drink the water surrounding him, it would recede just before his lips could touch it. Forever thirsty, forever hungry, forever inches from relief that never actually arrives. It's from Tantalus's name that we get our modern word tantalize, describing exactly this feeling of being teased with something desirable that remains permanently, frustratingly out of reach. There's also Ixion, who had committed the crime of attempting to seduce Hera, queen of the gods, after having already been shown extraordinary mercy by Zeus for an earlier murder. His punishment was to be bound eternally to a wheel of fire, spinning endlessly through the sky and through the underworld without rest. And there's the Danaids, 50 sisters who, in most versions of their myth, murdered their husbands on their wedding night at their father's command, and were punished by being forced to eternally carry water in jars full of holes, endlessly filling containers that could never actually hold anything, an image of futile, unending labor not unlike Sisyphus's boulder, though achieved through an entirely different method. What strikes me most, thinking through all of these punishments slowly, is how psychologically specific each one is. These aren't generic tortures. Each punishment is carefully, almost cruelly tailored to the specific nature of the crime committed, transforming abstract moral failings, deception, gluttony, betrayal, into concrete, eternal physical experiences. It suggests a mythology deeply interested in the idea that consequences should fit their causes, that justice, even eternal divine justice, ought to have a kind of internal logic rather than being simply arbitrary cruelty. And it's worth remembering, gently, before we move on, that these punishments were reserved for a genuine minority of souls, those who had committed the most severe transgressions against divine or natural order. For the vast majority of ordinary people, farmers, weavers, soldiers, mothers, the afterlife awaiting them in Hades's kingdom was simply the quiet gray meadow of asphodel, not a punishment at all, just a continuation, dim and peaceful, of existence itself. But there was also, for a fortunate few, something far better waiting for them. Let's go there now, into the one part of Hades's kingdom that actually resembled paradise. Fields of everlasting spring past the meadows, past the pit of Tartarus, in a separate region of the underworld entirely, or in some later versions of the myth, on distant islands out past the edges of the known world altogether, lay Elysium. I want you to imagine this place slowly, the way an ancient poet might have described it to an audience gathered around a fire on a summer evening, half in awe, half in longing. Unlike the gray, dim fields of asphodel, Elysium was described as bathed in constant, gentle light, neither the harsh brightness of full midday sun nor complete darkness, but something softer, something like an eternal late afternoon, warm without being oppressive. The air there was said to smell faintly of flowers that never wilted. Gentle breezes moved constantly, warm and comfortable, described by the poet Homer as blowing in from the direction of the great river Oceanus, refreshing and pleasant in a way that never grew tiresome. Who was allowed to live here, in this quiet, permanent paradise? Originally, in the oldest versions of the myth, entry was reserved almost exclusively for a small, elite group, heroes specifically favored by the gods, and in particular, individuals connected by blood to the gods themselves, demigods and the relatives of the divine. Over time, though, as Greek religious thought evolved across the centuries, the criteria for entry gradually expanded to include anyone who had lived a life of exceptional virtue, regardless of their bloodline. This shift matters quite a bit if you're trying to understand how Greek ideas about morality and the afterlife developed over time. Early on, your fate after death seemed largely tied to your birth, to whether you happened to have divine blood in your veins. Later, increasingly, your fate seemed tied more to how you had actually lived, to the choices you had made, and the virtues you had cultivated during your ordinary mortal life. In Elysium, according to the ancient sources, souls spent their eternity engaged in exactly the pleasures they had most enjoyed during life, but without any of life's usual burdens or limitations. Warriors who had loved combat continued to hold friendly athletic contests and mock battles, but without any of the genuine danger or lasting injury that had accompanied real warfare. Musicians continued to play, poets continued to compose, and the sounds of lyres and singing were said to drift constantly through the fields. Those who had loved horses continued to ride them across open, sunlit meadows. It was, in essence, an eternal continuation of life's best moments, stripped entirely of life's hardships, pain, and eventual decline. Some versions of the myth describe an even more exclusive tier above ordinary Elysium, called the Isles of the Blessed, reserved for souls who had proven themselves virtuous not just once, in a single lifetime, but across multiple successive lives, having been reincarnated repeatedly, and choosing goodness each time, until finally earning permanent placement on these distant paradise islands, floating somewhere in the ocean far beyond the edges of any map a living sailor could draw. This idea that souls might be reincarnated multiple times, judged after each life, and eventually rewarded or punished based on this accumulated pattern of choices, reflects the influence of certain philosophical and religious movements within ancient Greece, particularly a tradition connected to a figure named Orpheus. Yes, the same Orpheus from the story we heard earlier, whose followers, called Orphics, developed elaborate beliefs about the soul's journey through multiple lives. I find it worth pausing here quietly to think about why this idea of Elysium mattered so much to ordinary ancient Greeks, most of whom, statistically, would never have expected to end up there themselves. Life in the ancient world was, by almost any measure we'd use today, extraordinarily difficult. Disease killed indiscriminately. War was a near-constant threat across the fragmented Greek city-states. Childbirth carried enormous risk for both mother and infant. And even a successful, prosperous life typically involved far more physical labor and far less comfort than most of us experience today. Against this backdrop, the idea that an afterlife of genuine ease and pleasure might exist, somewhere for at least some souls, offered a kind of hope, a suggestion that suffering and struggle were not necessarily the final word on existence. And this hope wasn't reserved purely for abstract philosophical discussion. It found its way directly into how ordinary Greek families approached death and religion in their everyday lives, particularly through a set of religious practices centered around the very myth we spent time with earlier tonight, the story of Demeter and Persephone. Let's go there now, to a real place, a real ancient town, where ordinary people believed they could secure themselves a better version of the afterlife we've just been exploring. The secret at Eleusis, about 14 miles from Athens, along the coast, sat a town called Eleusis, and for well over 1,000 years, this town hosted one of the most important religious rituals in the entire ancient Greek world, something called the Eleusinian Mysteries. I want you to imagine what it might have felt like to be an ordinary Athenian citizen, or really any Greek-speaking person from across the wider Mediterranean world, deciding, at some point in your adult life, to make the journey to Eleusis and be initiated into these mysteries. And I use the word mysteries quite literally here, because that's exactly what made this particular religious practice so remarkable, and honestly so frustrating for modern historians trying to reconstruct exactly what happened there. Initiates were sworn to complete secrecy about the specific rituals and revelations involved, under penalty of death in ancient Athenian law, and remarkably, across more than 1,000 years of practice, involving many thousands of participants, that secrecy largely held. We know the mysteries happened, we know roughly how the surrounding events unfolded, but the core revelation, whatever was actually shown or said inside the sacred hall, remains genuinely unknown to us today. What we do know, though, is enough to paint a fairly vivid picture. The mysteries were directly connected to the myth of Demeter and Persephone that we spent time with earlier tonight. According to tradition, it was at Eleusis specifically that Demeter had rested during her exhausted, grief-stricken search for her missing daughter. And it was here that she had taught the local people the secrets of agriculture, as a gift of gratitude for their hospitality during her time of sorrow. Every year in the fall, a great procession would form in Athens, and thousands of initiates, along with priests and priestesses, would walk the long road from Athens to Eleusis together, a journey that would have taken most of a day on foot. Imagine being part of that crowd, dust rising from the road under thousands of sandaled feet, the late summer heat still lingering in the air, the sound of chanting and singing rising and falling around you as the procession moved slowly westward along the coast. Along the way, at a particular bridge, tradition held that participants would shout obscenities and insults at each other. A strange, almost carnival-like ritual said to commemorate a moment in the original myth, when an old woman's crude jokes had briefly made the grieving Demeter smile for the first time since losing her daughter. Upon arriving at Eleusis, after several more days of preparatory rituals, including a period of fasting that mirrored Demeter's own refusal to eat during her search, initiates would finally enter a large hall called the Telesterion, built specifically for this purpose. And there, under cover of darkness, illuminated only by torchlight, something happened. Ancient sources hint that it involved a reenactment of the Demeter and Persephone myth, that sacred objects were revealed, that words were spoken which were considered too holy to repeat outside the hall. Some ancient writers describe the mystery culminating in a moment of profound revelation, comparing the experience to somehow catching a glimpse of what awaited the soul after death. A preview, in some sense, of the peace that virtuous, initiated souls could expect to find in the afterlife. What we can say with more confidence, because several ancient authors, including figures like Cicero and Sophocles, wrote about the emotional impact of the mysteries without revealing their secret content, is that participants consistently describe the experience as profoundly comforting, particularly regarding their fear of death. Sophocles wrote that those who had witnessed the mysteries were thrice blessed, and that only they could truly live, while others, upon death, would face nothing but suffering. Cicero, writing centuries later as a Roman visitor to the mysteries, described them as having taught not just how to live joyfully, but how to die with better hope. I want you to sit with that idea for a moment quietly, because I think it reveals something essential about the practical, everyday role Hades and Persephone played in ancient Greek religious life, beyond just the dramatic stories we've been telling tonight. This wasn't merely mythology, entertainment told around a fire. It was a genuine, deeply felt religious practice, one that ordinary people, farmers and merchants and soldiers and mothers, participated in specifically because they hoped it would ease their fear of the one thing every human being throughout history has had to eventually face: death itself. The mysteries at Eleusis suggested, without ever fully explaining exactly how, that a better afterlife was available, not necessarily through heroic bloodline or extraordinary wealth, but through genuine participation in sacred ritual, through a kind of spiritual preparation available to virtually anyone who could make the journey, slave and free citizen alike in certain periods, men and women both, Athenians and foreigners alike. This relatively open accessibility was itself remarkable for the ancient world, and it helps explain why the mysteries remained popular and influential for well over 1,000 years, surviving long after the classical age of Greek city-states had given way to Roman rule, only finally ending when Christian emperors closed the sanctuary in the late 4th century AD. Through practices like these, Hades stopped being merely a distant, feared figure ruling an underground kingdom nobody wanted to think about too closely, and became instead someone ordinary people had a genuine, if cautious, relationship with. A god you might never pray to directly in casual daily life, the way you might pray to Athena before a difficult task or Aphrodite before a wedding, but a god whose domain you nonetheless hope to eventually enter under the best possible circumstances, having done what you could, through ritual and virtue, to secure a peaceful rather than a difficult afterlife. Let's step back now, gently, from the grand religious ceremonies and mythological dramas, and spend some quiet time with the more ordinary, everyday ways Greek families actually thought about, prepared for, and related to death and to Hades himself, in the simple rhythms of daily ancient life. How ordinary Greeks lived alongside death. I want you to imagine, for a moment, an ordinary household somewhere in ancient Athens, perhaps in the 5th century BC, during the height of the classical period. A modest home built around a small central courtyard, its walls made of mud brick, its roof covered in overlapping terracotta tiles. Inside, an oil lamp flickers on a low table, casting soft, moving shadows across the walls. Somewhere in the house, an elderly grandmother has just died quietly in her sleep, at the end of a long life. What happens next follows a pattern that would have been deeply familiar to virtually every person living in the ancient Greek world. A set of customs collectively known today as the prothesis and ekphora, the laying out and the carrying out of the dead. First comes the washing of the body, typically performed by the women of the household, close female relatives who would clean the body carefully with water and oil, treating it with a kind of tender, ritualized respect. The body would then be anointed with perfumed oils, dressed in fine clothing, often the best garments the family owned, and adorned with a wreath, similar to the wreaths worn at festivals and celebrations, a small but meaningful detail suggesting that death, while sorrowful, was still marked with a kind of ceremony, and honor rather than treated as something shameful to hide away. The body would then be laid out on a bed within the house, feet pointing toward the door, for a period of public mourning called the prothesis, during which family, friends, and neighbors would come to pay their respects. This is where you'd hear a very particular kind of sound throughout ancient Greek neighborhoods, the ritualized wailing and lamentation, often led by professional mourning women, hired specifically for their skill in producing dramatic, sorrowful cries and songs that helped the community process grief together, out loud, rather than privately and silently, the way many modern cultures tend to handle mourning. Then would come the coin, which we mentioned earlier, placed on the tongue or over the eyes of the deceased, payment for Charon's toll across the river Acheron. Alongside this, families often placed a small cake made of honey, meant for Cerberus, to help ensure the departed soul's safe and peaceful passage past the three-headed guardian and into the underworld proper. Imagine preparing that small honey cake in your own kitchen in the hours after losing someone you loved, your hands moving through familiar, practical motions, kneading and shaping, even while your heart was breaking, because tradition told you this small, sweet gift might genuinely help your loved one on their difficult journey ahead. Finally would come the ekphora, the funeral procession itself, typically held very early in the morning before sunrise, when the streets were quiet and the light was still soft and gray. The body, carried on a bier, would be taken either to burial or, quite commonly in ancient Greece, to cremation, accompanied by family and mourners walking together through the pre-dawn streets toward the cemetery, which by law in many city-states had to be located outside the city walls. Grave goods, small personal items the deceased had valued during life, favorite tools, pieces of jewelry, small clay figurines, would often be buried or cremated alongside them, meant to accompany the soul into whatever came next. And after the funeral itself, the mourning continued for a specific, culturally prescribed period. In Athens specifically, formal mourning typically lasted about 30 days, though the most intense visible signs of grief, wearing dark clothing, cutting one's hair short as a sign of mourning, avoiding festivals and celebrations, were usually most pronounced in the immediate days following the death. Families would also return to the grave on specific subsequent days, often the third day and the ninth day after burial, to perform additional rites and offerings, maintaining an ongoing relationship with their dead rather than treating the funeral as a single, final event. Beyond individual family mourning, there was also a broader, city-wide ritual observance connected to the dead in ancient Athens, a festival called the Anthesteria, held each spring, which was itself deeply connected to themes we've already explored tonight. Part of this multi-day festival specifically honored the dead, believed to briefly return to walk among the living during this period. Families would leave offerings, and there was a widespread belief that spirits of the departed roamed the city during certain hours of the festival, leading to some rather practical, almost charmingly mundane precautions. People would chew on buckthorn leaves and smear their doorways with pitch, believed to ward off wandering spirits, and at the festival's conclusion, there was a ritual command shouted through the streets, telling the spirits it was time to leave, that the festival had ended, and that they needed to return to their proper place in Hades's kingdom until the following year. I find this particular detail wonderfully human, in a quiet way, when you sit with it. Even a culture that took its underworld mythology as seriously as the ancient Greeks did could still fold a certain gentle, almost domestic practicality into how they handled the idea of the dead briefly walking among the living. Not pure terror, not pure reverence, but something closer to how you might handle an unexpected houseguest who has overstayed their welcome. Kindly enough acknowledged, but also, eventually, politely asked to head home. Throughout all of these customs, Hades himself remained a somewhat distant figure in the actual daily religious practice of most Greek families. Unlike gods such as Athena or Apollo or Demeter, who received frequent, direct prayers and dedicated temples in nearly every Greek city, Hades had remarkably few temples built specifically in his honor throughout the Greek world. This wasn't because people didn't believe in him or didn't respect his power. Quite the opposite. It seems to have stemmed from a kind of careful avoidance, a reluctance to draw his direct attention through too much active worship, similar to how you might avoid discussing an illness too loudly for fear of somehow inviting it closer. People often used euphemisms rather than saying his name directly in casual conversation, referring to him instead as Ploughton, the rich one, or simply as the god below, or the host of many, a title referring to the countless souls he hosted within his vast kingdom. There's something worth sitting with in this pattern of respectful avoidance, something that connects directly to how many people across many different cultures throughout history, including many people alive today, have related to the topic of death itself. Not necessarily through active, frequent engagement, but through a kind of careful, respectful distance, acknowledged but not dwelt upon too directly in the ordinary course of daily life, reserved instead for the specific, necessary moments when death actually arrives at your own door and can no longer be avoided or spoken around. Now, let's turn our attention to a different, quieter question. What was Hades's relationship actually like with his fellow gods, his brothers ruling the sky and the sea, and why did he so consistently choose to remain apart from them? The brother who stayed home throughout the vast body of surviving Greek mythology, one pattern regarding Hades stands out clearly and consistently. He almost never appears at Mount Olympus. While Zeus and Poseidon, along with the other Olympian gods, are frequently depicted attending feasts together, arguing over mortal affairs, taking sides in wars, falling in and out of favor with various heroes, Hades simply isn't there. He doesn't attend the great councils of the gods. He doesn't get directly involved in the Trojan War the way Athena, Apollo, Aphrodite, and several other gods famously did, taking sides and actively influencing the battle's outcome. He rarely, if ever, involves himself in mortal affairs at all, beyond the specific, unavoidable moment of someone's actual death. Some ancient sources suggest this separation wasn't purely a matter of personal preference, but was actually built into the structure of the cosmos itself, following that original division of territory among the three brothers after the Titanomachy. Hades's domain was specifically the Underworld, and there seems to have been an understood expectation, perhaps even something like a rule, that he would remain there, tending to his own vast responsibilities, rather than involving himself in matters belonging properly to his brother's territories. This creates an interesting family dynamic when you think about it slowly, the way you might think through an old, complicated family relationship you've never quite fully understood. Zeus, the youngest of the three brothers by circumstance of his father's error with the stone, became king of the gods and ruler of Olympus, a position of enormous visible authority and prestige. Poseidon ruled the seas, similarly visible, similarly prestigious, frequently interacting with sailors, with coastal cities, with heroes undertaking sea voyages. And Hades, arguably ruling the largest and most permanently populated domain of all three, since every mortal being eventually became his subject, remained essentially invisible to ongoing Greek cultural and religious life, tucked away beneath the earth, rarely mentioned, rarely visited, rarely directly worshipped. There's a case to be made, and several modern scholars have made versions of this argument, that this arrangement wasn't really a demotion or a punishment at all, despite how it might initially appear when compared to his brother's more glamorous, visible positions. Rather, it reflects a genuinely different kind of power, one based on permanence and inevitability rather than visible, active display. Zeus's power could be seen and felt directly through thunder and lightning. Poseidon's power could be seen and felt through storms and earthquakes. But Hades's power required no demonstration at all. Its inevitability was simply assumed, built into the very fabric of mortal existence. Everyone would meet him eventually, without exception, regardless of how they lived, regardless of what they believed, regardless of what other gods they worshipped throughout their lives. There was a strange, quiet confidence in a kind of authority that never needed to prove itself through spectacle. That said, the myths do preserve a small handful of moments highlighting tension, or at least a kind of formal, careful distance, between Hades and his brothers. We've already talked about the arrangement surrounding Persephone, made by Zeus without directly consulting Demeter, which Hades benefited from but which also required him to eventually compromise once Demeter's grief threatened the entire mortal world. There's also a story involving Heracles, during a different labor entirely from his encounter with Cerberus, in which the hero actually wounded Hades directly with an arrow during a conflict at the city of Pylos, forcing Hades to travel up to Mount Olympus itself to be healed by Paeon, the physician of the gods, one of the extremely rare instances of Hades leaving his kingdom at all. Imagine that scene for a moment, an underworld god, feared and avoided by virtually everyone in the mortal world, forced to make the awkward journey up to his brother's golden halls, wounded, seeking medical attention among gods who lived very differently from how he did. It's a small, almost comic detail in an otherwise serious mythology, and it humanizes him in an interesting way. Even the Lord of the Dead, apparently, could be hurt, and even he occasionally needed help from family he didn't often see. Beyond these isolated incidents, though, the overall picture that emerges from ancient sources is one of relative peace and mutual respect between the three brothers, each maintaining their own domain without excessive interference in the other's affairs. Compare this to the frequent, dramatic conflicts you find among other groups of gods and goddesses throughout Greek mythology, the constant rivalries, the jealous schemes, the elaborate revenge plots that fill so many other stories, and Hades's relative stability, his willingness to simply remain in his own kingdom and manage his own responsibilities without constant drama, starts to look almost refreshingly mature by comparison. This brings us, gently, to a question worth sitting with as we begin moving toward the later part of tonight's story. If Hades was genuinely this stable, this fair, this consistently focused on maintaining order rather than causing chaos, why did later cultures, and eventually our own modern popular imagination, transform him so thoroughly into something resembling evil incarnate, a figure closer to the devil than to the careful, dignified ruler the ancient Greeks themselves actually described? Let's explore that transformation now, slowly, because I think it tells us as much about later history as it does about the original mythology itself. How a careful king became a cartoon villain if you were to travel forward in time from ancient Greece, past the rise and fall of Rome, through the medieval period, and eventually into the modern era. You'd find that Hades's reputation had undergone an enormous transformation, one that would likely have genuinely surprised the ancient Greeks who first told these stories. Some of this transformation began quite early, actually, during the Roman period, when Greek mythology was absorbed and adapted into Roman religious practice. The Romans equated Hades with their own god Pluto, and Pluto, while retaining much of Hades's original character, existed within a slightly different cultural context, one that eventually intersected with the rise of Christianity across the Roman Empire. And this is really where the most significant transformation began. As Christianity spread and eventually became the dominant religious framework across Europe, early Christian theologians needed vocabulary to describe concepts of hell, damnation, and the underworld within their own developing theological system. Rather than inventing entirely new terminology from scratch, they often borrowed directly from existing Greek and Roman religious language that was already familiar to the populations they were converting. The Greek word Hades, in fact, appears directly in the New Testament, in the original Greek text, used to translate concepts of the afterlife and the realm of the dead. And this word choice, over the following centuries, gradually began collapsing the distinction between the ancient Greek underworld and the Christian concept of hell as a place of eternal punishment and suffering for the wicked. This is a crucial distinction worth understanding clearly, because it explains so much of the confusion that persists even today. In original Greek mythology, Hades's kingdom was not primarily a place of punishment. Remember, we spent real time earlier tonight walking through the geography of the underworld, and most souls, the overwhelming majority, ended up not in Tartarus being eternally punished, but simply in the quiet, neutral asphodel meadows, neither rewarded nor punished, simply continuing to exist. Tartarus, the punishment section, was reserved for a genuine minority who had committed severe offenses, primarily against the gods themselves. But as Christian theology developed its own concept of hell, a place specifically and exclusively for eternal punishment of sinners, the borrowed Greek terminology increasingly became associated with that punitive concept rather than the original, more varied Greek understanding. Over the following centuries, as this theological blending continued, and as medieval and later Renaissance European art and literature increasingly depicted hell in vivid, terrifying detail, complete with fire, demons, and eternal torment, drawing partly on Christian theology and partly on remnants of classical imagery, Hades's original character became increasingly obscured beneath these newer, darker associations. By the time popular culture in more recent centuries began drawing on Greek mythology for entertainment, for children's books, for animated films, for video games, the cultural memory of who Hades actually was in the original mythology had become significantly muddled, blended together with entirely separate religious and cultural traditions about hell, the devil, and eternal damnation. This is largely why, if you ask most people today, especially in America, to describe Hades, you're likely to hear something closer to a description of Satan, a cackling, malevolent villain scheming against humanity and against the other, presumably good, gods, rather than the careful, orderly, somewhat withdrawn administrator of a vast and largely neutral afterlife that the ancient Greeks themselves actually described in their oldest surviving texts. Certain popular animated portrayals from recent decades have leaned heavily into this villain interpretation, giving Hades a scheming, comically evil personality that, while entertaining, bears very little resemblance to how ancient Greek audiences would have actually understood the god they were watching depicted. I think it's worth sitting with this transformation for a moment quietly, because it says something interesting about how mythology and religious belief evolve and blend together across centuries and across different cultures encountering each other. The original Greeks weren't naive or simplistic in how they understood death and the afterlife. They developed a remarkably nuanced system, with multiple regions serving different purposes, judges assessing individual moral character, a possibility of paradise for the virtuous, punishment reserved specifically for severe transgression, and a vast, quiet middle ground for the ordinary majority of humanity who had lived neither particularly good nor particularly wicked lives. Hades within this system wasn't the source of evil or suffering. He was simply the administrator, the keeper of order within a complex, morally graduated afterlife that reflected genuine philosophical thought about justice, memory, and what it might mean for a human life to matter after it ends. It's only through centuries of cultural blending, theological adaptation, and eventually modern entertainment simplifying complex mythology into easily digestible villain and hero archetypes, that this careful, dignified figure gradually transformed into something closer to a cartoon devil. Understanding this history, I think, gives us a chance to appreciate the original character a bit more clearly, to separate the ancient Greek Hades from the borrowed theological baggage he eventually accumulated over the following 2,000 years. Let's spend our final substantial stretch of time tonight, then, gathering together everything we've learned, and thinking carefully about what this quiet, misunderstood God story actually teaches us, both about the ancient world that created him, and perhaps about our own relationship with the same questions his mythology was always trying to answer. What the ancient Greeks understood that we sometimes forget. I want you to think back, for a moment, gently, over everything we've walked through together tonight. We started with a father so afraid of losing power that he swallowed his own children. We watched those children grow, escape, and fight a 10-year war that reshaped the entire structure of the cosmos. We watched three brothers draw lots for the sky, the sea, and the underworld, and we followed the quietest of the three down into his new kingdom, a realm of rivers with names like woe and wailing and forgetting, guarded by a three-headed dog who preferred honey cakes to violence, ruled from a palace built for permanence rather than splendor. We spent real time with a young goddess taken from a meadow full of wildflowers, and with her mother's grief, powerful enough to nearly starve the entire world, and with the strange, bittersweet compromise that gave us, if this myth is to be believed, the changing of the seasons themselves. We met a musician who almost brought his wife back from the dead through nothing but the beauty of his music, undone in the very last moment by an entirely understandable, entirely human failure of trust. We met a strong man who wrestled a monster with his bare hands, rather than break his word to a god he'd been told to respect. We sat briefly with the punished, the boulder pusher and the ever-thirsty king, and we understood why their names became our words for endless, pointless labor and permanent, frustrated desire. We walked gently, through paradise, through fields of eternal soft light where warriors held friendly games and poets composed without end. We joined a procession walking from Athens to Eleusis, dust rising under thousands of sandaled feet, carrying with us the quiet hope that participating in ancient, secret rituals might genuinely ease our fear of the one thing every single person throughout all of human history has eventually had to face. And we sat with ordinary families, washing their dead with careful hands, placing small coins and small honey cakes, doing everything within their power to make sure someone they loved would be cared for on a journey none of them could actually accompany them on. Through all of this, one thing remains remarkably consistent. The ancient Greeks did not imagine death as something to be defeated, avoided, or denied. They imagined it as a kingdom, vast and orderly, ruled by a god who, whatever his fearsome reputation, governed with consistency and fairness rather than cruelty. This is worth sitting with quietly, because it's a genuinely different way of relating to mortality than many of us are used to in the modern world, where death is so often pushed to the margins of daily conversation, hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, rarely discussed directly except in moments of acute, unavoidable crisis. The Greeks, by contrast, built an entire, detailed mythology around the specific mechanics of dying and what came after, not because they were morbid or obsessed with darkness, but because they seemed to understand something we sometimes forget in our own busy, distraction-filled modern lives. That thinking clearly and carefully about death, giving it shape and structure, and even, in its own way, a kind of dignity, might actually be one of the most useful things a person or a culture can do with their limited time. Not to conquer the fear of death entirely. That's probably impossible for anyone, ancient or modern, but to make peace with it enough to live more fully in the meantime. Hades himself, in the end, stands as a strangely comforting figure once you understand him properly, stripped of all the later theological baggage that transformed him into something closer to a devil. He is not chaos. He is not cruelty for its own sake. He is order, patiently maintained, in the one part of existence that ultimately touches every single living being without exception. There's something almost restful in that idea, if you let yourself sit with it slowly enough, the way you might sit with any difficult truth right before finally drifting off to sleep. Whatever else happens in a human life, however chaotic or uncertain or difficult it becomes, there is, waiting quietly beneath everything, a kind of order, patient and unhurried, keeping things in their proper place. I think that's a good thought to fall asleep with tonight, honestly. Not fear, but a kind of quiet trust that even the parts of existence we understand least, the parts we're most afraid to think about directly, might still be held together by something patient, something fair, something that has been doing its careful work since long before any of us arrived, and will continue doing it long after we're gone. And that, my friend, brings us to the end of tonight's journey down into the quiet halls of Hades. I hope by now your eyes are heavy, your breathing has slowed, and somewhere in the back of your mind, instead of tomorrow's worries, you're picturing a field of soft asphodel flowers, or the warm, gentle light of Elysium, or maybe just a small oil lamp flickering in an ancient Athenian courtyard, casting long, peaceful shadows on a wall that hasn't existed for over 2,000 years. If you enjoyed spending this quiet evening with me, and with this quiet, misunderstood God, I'd be glad to have you back again. This channel is called The Quiet Past, also known as Boring History for Sleep, and every episode works the same way tonight's did. Real history, real mythology, told slowly, gently, without any of the noise or urgency the rest of the internet usually demands from you. If that sounds like something you'd like more of, consider subscribing and maybe leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are right now. I always find it strangely comforting to imagine all the different places, all the different time zones, where people are lying in the dark together in their own quiet way, listening to the same old stories. Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you right now, I hope you sleep well tonight. Thank you for spending this time with me and with him. Good night.